welcome to another of my tabletop game lectures. I am Jason Bulmahn. I'm the director of game design at Paizo and the creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game. And today, what I'd like to do is talk to all of you about creating and populating your game with exciting and vibrant non-player characters, or NPCs. As someone who's been running games for an awfully long time, I think NPCs form the backbone of most engaging stories. Monsters are great, villains are awesome, but without good NPCs, your story's going to fall flat. It's not going to feel like a well-rounded, complete game world. So having good tools and tricks in your pocket, having a good understanding of the role of an NPC and how you use them at the table is critical to kind of bringing your story to life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this lecture down into 3 pieces, and then we're going to open it up for some Q&A. For those of you watching this on YouTube, the Q&A and this entire lecture is broadcast live on Twitch on Saturdays at 4 p.m. Pacific time. I've been doing these now for about a month now, and I'm going to keep them going for the future, so tune in. I'll put a link to my Twitch in the comments down below. So let's get started here with part 1 of this lecture, which is the role of NPCs. And first of all, why do they matter? I mean, understanding why we are even bothering to talk about this is kind of the first step to understanding the role of NPCs in your game. And first off, NPCs create that kind of vibrant fabric of your world. And I'm talking about most kind of generic worlds. You might have a world that's mostly empty and unpopulated. That's a thing. But in most worlds, there are towns filled with people going about their ordinary everyday lives, and these people form the texture and backdrop of your setting. They are critical to kind of creating that kind of fabric that the players understand to be the world. And making that work can seem very daunting. It's like, how many of these people do I have to make up? The answer is not that many. There's an old trick, which is if you just have enough the characters with some texture and detail, the players fill in the blanks. It's like when you're drawing a brick wall, you don't have to draw every brick. You draw a handful of bricks here and there, and the human mind just fills it in and treats the whole thing like a brick wall. The same thing with NPCs. If you have enough of them to kind of fairly represent the world, then everybody is able to just kind of fill in the blanks, and it all works. Now, NPCs also are really critical because they are an opportunity for role-playing. The players are going to play with themselves and talk amongst themselves. But I think it is NPCs that form that critical role-playing dialogue between the GM and the players. I mean, you got monsters that they can fight and kill, and they can talk to them while they're doing it. But NPCs form that kind of critical backbone of the role-playing of the world. They also serve as a spot for exposition and the initiation of stories. So your NPCs are a great way to fill in the details of your world, to fill in that rich history you've built, to tell the tale of the strange haunted castle up on the hill, to talk about the madness of the king and how it might be solved. NPCs tend to be a critical way for you to get that story, to get that dialogue over to the players. You could just have it written on walls and stuff, but NPCs are a more entertaining way for that to happen. And lastly, NPCs are just fun. They're a way for the GM to actually just have some fun and roleplay and add variety to the story and their play experience. Remember, the GM is a player too. You are participating in this story, and NPCs are a critical way in which you do so. Now, before we get too deep into this, I want to talk about what the kind of roles I generally put NPCs in. Because I think it's valuable as a GM to kind of sort NPCs by category, to understand their function in the game and what you're going to be using them for is really critical to managing your workload. I think being a good GM is a lot of things, but one of the keys is managing the work that you do and not wasting your effort creating things that you don't need, Or, because that will often lead to you not having the things that you do need to make a successful session. Categorizing NPCs and understanding where you need detail versus where you don't is a critical skill. So, at its most basic, the most basic NPC you can have in your game world is what I like to just call an extra. They're a character in the background. Are they a person? Are they a blob? Do they have statistics? Probably not. They're just people who exist in the world, but they still count as an NPC. When the players go to the town market and it's filled with people shopping and going about their business, all of those are extras until somebody decides to talk to them. They are literally there to just be background filler for the world, and to some extent they're no different than a building or a cart or a horse or the town fountain. They exist to fill in the world. So minimal detail on these folks. You treat them as kind of a mob. They're a formless mass of characterization that you don't really need to know a lot about, other than where they are and what they are doing. And to that end, they are literally nothing more than that. I think those characters can end up with throwaway names. They can end up with dialogue. The PCs, after all, might come up to an extra and be like, hey, where's the local, fruit cart? And that character now suddenly rises out of the texture and is still an extra because you don't really know anything about that character. And you don't probably need to long term. But they're now at least more than just kind of the formless background. But I still kind of think of them as extras because they only become a formed character when you need them to. The next kind of level up from that is like, I call them recurring. They're just recurring characters. And these are people who have names, they exist in the town, but they're mostly perfunctory. Like the owner of the blacksmith shop. That character very likely is a recurring character. And they have a name, they own the business, they have some mannerisms, they are a stable part of the world background. If they return to that spot, they're going to meet that character again. That character has some detail and some anchoring to tie it to your world and your narrative, but there's not much to them. Their job is to serve a function that the PCs undoubtedly need. Usually this involves shopping or gathering information, or the local priest at the temple that the PCs don't worship is very likely just a recurring character that they might go and talk to on occasion, but otherwise don't. These are characters that you assign a minimal amount of detail to and can use that to call it up to add kind of stable texture, right? If the other characters are kind of the fabric, those extras just form the fabric of the background of the world. These ones actually hold it in place because they are the points of fixed reality. Those extras change week by week. If they return to the market the next week and ask someone else where a different cart is, they're not going to talk to the same extra they talked to the week before who told them where the fruit cart was. Recurring character, however, always the same. Now, I think there's a level up from recurring character, and when you get to that, you're in the supporting cast of the story. These are characters that actively participate in the narrative. They are more important than, say, the local blacksmith or the member of the clergy that nobody venerates, right? Oh, nobody here worships Desna, so we don't really have much point to talk to the priest of Desna, but we do have a champion of Sarenrae. So the high priest of the temple of Sarenrae probably is more than a recurring character. It's a member of the supporting cast, and these characters kind of hover much closer to the story. They might be involved, they might be anchors to the story, they might be initiators of adventures. These characters are important to the PCs. They are characters that the PCs themselves might have deep, meaningful relationships with, either in their backstory or in their, throughout their quest or their missions. These characters become important. Very, very frequently, these characters are actually also important to the game world. And this has to do with the fact that the player characters themselves end up being important to the game world. And as emergent heroes in a community, they will very likely end up drawing the attention of the important movers and shakers in that community. So if if the town has an important and powerful mayor, odds are this is going to end up being a member of the supporting cast, because the mayor is probably going to end up interacting with the player characters much more directly. More important than perhaps the blacksmith. But, and we'll get more of this later, characters can change roles within this pretty fluidly. We'll get to that. And lastly, there is only one role I put higher than supporting cast. And this is a role that GMs, that you as a GM have to handle very, very carefully, and it's the sidekick. This is an NPC that actually travels with the characters. Maybe not all the time, but on occasion. This character is almost part of the group. It's a character run mostly by the GM, but is someone who is ever present in the story. And then this character can take a lot of different forms, from, you picked up the leadership feat and you got a cohort, if we're talking first edition, or just this mission requires us to travel with this ranger. This character is now a sidekick for a limited period of time. Sidekicks have to be handled very, very carefully for a variety of reasons. First of all, they can easily be seen as the GM's agent in the story, and that has pros and cons. It's a pro in that you can actively move the story forward in the direction that you want them to go, but in doing so, you can rob the players of their agency. And you really don't want to do that, right? The story is about them, not about your character traveling with them. That's not how it works. So, I think that helps us understand the role of NPCs in the world. We talked about why they mattered and how they are used. So, before we move forward, let's just recap. The role of NPCs in the game. Why do they matter? They help create a vibrant and rich world. They provide opportunities for role-playing with the players, role-playing with the GM, and they provide exposition and story initiation. They can give out quests. That makes them pretty important. And then how are they frequently used? You can have extras, recurring characters, supporting cast, and sidekicks. So, let's move on to the important stuff. Let's talk about details. Now, when you're building NPCs for your story, the first thing you're going to do is look at the adventure that you have and decide, hey, where do I need NPCs? What role do they need to play? Are they in town? Are they off in a dungeon? Where do I need to build NPCs? And that's a very complex topic. I think I covered some of that in the basics of world building that talks about that. What I want to talk about here today, though, is I want to focus on, you figured out what your NPCs you need for your story, right? So they're in town. Okay, great. I need some extras. I need a few recurring characters because they're going to the fair. And so I'm going to need the carnies who work at the various parts of the fair. And then I need the supporting cast character that gives them their mission, who works in the big tent, and and then there's two other supporting cast who help move the story forward once they travel from the fair to the cave nearby where one of their members went missing on their way here. Great. It's easy to sort out where you need those people and those players. What I want to talk about now is you want to figure out what details each one needs. And I like to break the details up by category and understand that, the higher up they are on that list between extra, recurring character, supporting cast, and sidekick, they need more and more details of each. Extras need almost nothing from any of these lists. Recurring characters need a bit in the beginning. So it'll make sense. It's all about levels of detail. And except for the last one, it's building down on this list determines the gravity of an NPC. So, first off, there's just the basics. What does the character look like? What do they do for a living? What's their general mannerisms? This is mostly details that you need for extras, right? So if you're in a small town and they are, let's just say, turnip farmers, you're in, Etrin's Folly, and you're surrounded by turnip farmers, I now kind of know the look and occupation and general mannerisms of all those extras. They don't have names. They're just the people who live in town. And for extras, that may be all you ever need. I would say that there's one thing that I add on to this list of this basics. And this is something that as a GM I think is a handy tip. I'm sure you've heard it other places before, which is keep a list of disposable names behind your screen. Just write them down beforehand. You probably don't need more than a half a dozen for any given session, but have that list of disposable names back there for when they go and talk to that one extra and you need a name right then and there. Because nothing can be worse than having to come up with a name on the fly and ending up with Farmer Bob. That's not great, right? There are plenty of fantasy name generators out there. If you're bad at it, you can just generate a name, and what I like to do is take the first half and second half of all the names that are in there, shift them off by one column, and now I've got a whole list of unique names. Players actually kind of delight in catching the GM off guard with a character that they think is a throwaway nothing character. I have known a number of players over the years who take a certain amount of twisted delight in trying to gotcha the GM by being like, you don't know who this extra is, you're just making this up, so I'm going to force you to come up with a name. Somebody in chat asked me if it was Eric. It might be. Eric might be that kind of GM. All right, so beyond the basics, the next step up is some elements of the character's personality. And I think extras even need a little bit of this, but once again, I think you treat extras as a formless mass. So you don't need individuals, you just need a general vibe of the outcome. So, how does the character talk? Do they have any common sayings? Are there any common aphorisms for the community? How do they interact is basically what you're trying to figure out here. And these are the real basics of personality. You're not asking, for what their favorite meal is or anything like that. All you're trying to do is suss out, if the players go and talk to them, how am I going to talk back? And really, at this level of detail, it's all in relation to the player characters. That's all that matters. How they are in relation to each other doesn't matter, because they're not on screen enough for them to interact with each other in a way that you really have to worry about at all, because they're just background texture. The more they come into the foreground, the more you need more details in this. So, the bit on basics about knowing what they look like in their occupation, well, I can say generally that, they're extras. So they're all wearing rough-spun woolen trousers, simple fleece tunics, and many of them wear green vests, which is the style of this village. And that's fine for the background of all the characters that are not in stage. But the moment they come and talk to one, they might notice that one has a tin turnip badge on his lapel, and he is actually the farmer who's in charge of grading turnips. Very important character. Not really. He's still an extra that I've just given one extra level of detail to. Now, I might give this person a disposable name, and all of a sudden they've gone from extra and they are creeping up towards recurring character if the players suddenly think that character is important and come back to talk to them more later. So let's get beyond basics and personality. Let's go to the next level of detail, and this is what I like to call scripting. It's more of a video game term, but basically scripting is saying this NPC actually exists in a persistent way, and this character is now a bit more than a formless nobody who vanishes the moment the players stop paying attention to them. Like, extras don't have object permanence. The moment you stop looking at them, they cease to exist. But the moment you get up to recurring character, now you need some scripting. Now you need an understanding of what that character does. Now, once again, levels of detail here right? If this is a character that you don't really need to know much about, then, you don't really worry about it too much. But the more they come fully formed, the more they become a character that the players are going to interact with multiple times, the more you need to start thinking about these sorts of things. So, what's their daily routine, right? Let's take the blacksmith, the town blacksmith for an example. The town blacksmith gets up relatively early in the morning, not as early as farmers, though. He's a blacksmith. Doesn't have to get up at the crack of dawn, can get up an hour later, makes his way into town, gets the furnace fired. This happens before the shop is even open. So, he stokes back up the furnace fires for the first 2 hours, gets everything ready for the day, opens up the shop, continues to work until, mid-afternoon where he takes lunch, then comes back, opens up the shop for the rest of the afternoon, and then when he's done, goes to the tavern, has a few drinks, covered in soot and grime, then makes his way home and calls it a night. Ta-da! I have just scripted that character. Now, if that ever becomes relevant, yeah, you might have to write it down, but you probably don't. You can probably remake that up on the fly whenever you need it. It's just a matter of understanding if the players need the blacksmith, they shouldn't be able to get the blacksmith at 1 in the morning, not without going to his house and waking him up, which is going to make for a cranky blacksmith. Scripting also starts looking at the NPC in terms of what interesting places the NPC is tied to, right? What are the places of interest for that NPC? Because you're starting to decide where that NPC goes. Where's the NPC live? Where's their place of business? Where do they go for recreation? Is the NPC devout? So can you find them in church? All those sorts of things are questions you might have to start asking, but you don't until they gain a level of prominence where that becomes relevant. All of this is about gauging how much you actually need. You don't need to sit down and figure out where the blacksmith is going to be at 2:38 p.m. on a Sunday until that character is important enough for that to matter. And also, obviously, when it comes to scripting, you also are starting to figure out how they're actually tied to other NPCs. Maybe this blacksmith goes every day and goes and has a ale at the local tavern, after work with the carpenter who works across the street. And the two of them are sitting side by side at the tavern every night. And they sit there and wisecrack and make jokes, and they may become fixtures of the background tapestry of the players' time spent in that tavern themselves. In fact, that may be how the players first met them, as just background extras. Who's there? I don't know, the blacksmith and the carpenter, and they hang out drinking every night. Great. They're extras until they go to their shop, and now they're recurring characters. You see how this goes. The next level of detail that you're going to want to think about for your NPCs is how they might evolve. And now we're getting to the point where they're not even recurring characters anymore. The moment the characters start evolving, you can have just recurring characters that evolve, but now we're really starting to talk about supporting cast characters. These are characters that have motivations. They want things. They have goals and desires. They're not going to be static. That blacksmith might keep repeating that pattern week after week after week for the entire campaign, because it may never matter. That blacksmith doesn't need to change. But if that blacksmith now is, if the blacksmith's mother has gone missing, and he closes up shop because she's been taken hostage, and he had to sell all of his ore to pay off her ransom, all of a sudden that character now is even more. It's becoming a supporting cast character because the blacksmith might come to the PCs and ask for help. So now we have motivations. We have triggers that we are building into these characters that cause them to change. So that blacksmith, who desperately needs the player's help after they helped the blacksmith, he might reopen his shop, he might expand it, and he might start offering them discounts and deals, and now they're friends, and they check in on him, and he checks in on them, and all of a sudden the blacksmith has gone from being kind of a minor supporting character to someone who is actually a kind of a member of the cast. And yes, the players themselves might even notice a change in the character's routine that leads to adventure, right? It's about creating this fabric. That way, when you start disrupting the fabric, the players notice. That's building the kind of tapestry of your world. And, having characters that have their own desire and motivation is really going to help you bring that to life. So, and that leads to kind of some of the highest level of detail, which is like story hooks. That blacksmith needing your help, that's the highest level of detail an NPC can really kind of get. Because now they are actually actively a part of the campaign. They are part of the player's story. They are part of the adventure story. They are delivering emergent detail. They are basically now a part of the campaign in a way that all those other lesser NPCs just kind of don't fulfill. And all of this, by the way, speaks to the statistics of an NPC. So at its very basics, the statistics of an NPC is nothing at all. It's like, oh, those background characters, that level 0, level 1 farmer in the background, I have no idea what his statistics are. It's not important. But, I do know that it is a character and not a monster, right? I do know that it's probably like level 1, so there is simple details that I know. I know its ancestry. I have a good idea about its career, which probably gives me enough that I could ad-lib some rolls for it if I had to. If the players drop a fireball in the middle of town, how many common folk die? The answer is most of them. So, that is the most simple level of detail. The next level of detail is usually reserved for recurring characters and in some cases even supporting cast, which is kind of the mid-step. It's not a complete stat block, but what it is the relevant stats that character is going to be useful for. So when the blacksmith is just kind of a recurring character, you probably want to know what the blacksmith's craft skill is. You probably want to know what their diplomacy skill is and maybe their intimidate, their social skills, the way they're going to interact with the player characters. You might want to start having those details. But you don't need to know the blacksmith's AC, the blacksmith's hit points, what special abilities the blacksmith has. None of that's important to you just yet. That is saved for the final level of detail, which is basically a complete stat block. And that you're only really going to need for supporting cast that might end up in combat with the characters or sidekicks. All sidekicks are going to need, a complete stat block. So, that's pretty obvious, but, worth stating. All right. So to sum up the levels of detail, you start off with the basics: appearance, occupation, mannerisms. Have a list of names. Next up is kind of personality. What kind of sayings do they have? What interactions? How do they relate to the PCs? Next up is scripting. Do they have a daily routine? What are their ties to other NPCs and places? That's kind of that level of importance. The moment you kind of hit this point, you're probably talking about a recurring character. Next up, how does that character evolve? Does it? That kind of tells you where it is on the grade of importance when it comes to NPCs. What are the motivations? What triggers the character to change? What is its desires? What's the character's goals? Now, and finally, then you get to story hooks. How does the character tie to the campaign narrative? Finally, you get to statistics. Are they simple? Are they detailed? Are they complete? And where are they going? All right. Let's move on to the third part of this here lecture. And this is kind of asking, how do you use the NPCs in play? You've built them. You kind of know a bunch of details about them. You know a fair number of bits about how they're supposed to respond in play, but now you got to kind of figure out, okay, so you got them, how are you going to use them? So first of all, NPCs, the most basic functionality of NPCs is to create that texture. I've been talking about that a lot throughout this stream. I want to kind of stress it right now, that NPCs are there to create kind of a fabric and texture for your game. You are filling them in as needed to simulate the setting as you envision it. That's their most basic function. But the thing that you always have to be ready for with NPCs, the thing that is the most challenging about managing NPCs, is that they are on demand. They are non-existent until you need them, and then they are everywhere, and you are on the hook to constantly be creating them as needed to fully play out the story and the narrative. So, I think once you kind of get the hang of this, once you get kind of all the tools put together, you can... It is a skilled GM that makes it appear that every NPC was planned and thought out. Even the ones that you literally made up 2 seconds before the players interacted with the character. So in that, NPCs are when a GM is usually most at their kind of height of having to improv. The NPCs are that spot where the players can literally put you on the spot every second of the game, and you have to create kind of new interesting characters out of nothing. But you shouldn't let that go to waste, and that's the thing. That effort, that time you spent planning, okay, I know kind of what my extras are, I have some recurring characters, and when you have to upgrade characters, when you have to take an extra and turn it into a recurring character because they're really fascinated by the guy who sells turnips, that character has now become a recurring character. Make sure you take some notes. And this is what I call design through improv, right? So you've improv'd this character, but now you've basically done the design work, and you've just done it live. Well, make sure to save that. Make sure to use it. Keep it. And make sure you write it down. As a GM, I always keep a notebook behind my GM screen that I will use to just write scratch notes. I'll also use it to keep track of hit points and stuff like that. And at the end of sessions, I will take that and transfer it to my campaign notes, just so that I have it later on when I need to call it back up again. That can be a real challenge, but doing it is generally very satisfying. And this comes to not just new characters you have to kind of invent, but any character that evolves and changes. You're going to want to make notes about that. I like to keep notes next to NPCs about, anything important that might come up in the future, and just use that to expand their general entry in my notes. If an NPC needs to be promoted, needs to be demoted, you can create... The thing that I think is hard sometimes for a GM to swallow is you create this character that you think is going to be supporting cast, and the players don't interact with the character at all. They just kind of ignore him and move on, and now you feel like that work is wasted. It's not. You can just demote that character concept, take that knowledge, that rules importance, that story importance that you had built for that character, and just bolt it onto another character. Flexibility behind the screen is one of your strongest tools as a GM. Being able to take bits and pieces that you have already built that are meant to serve a different function, but kit bashing them onto something else is the way that it always looks like you have an answer for everything at the table. And that is the real skill of being of a good GM. I think it's also important that you should, when thinking about NPCs, you should really remember that they should really be everywhere. And this is the, well, of course moment, but it's real easy when you're writing out your story and your adventure to send the players to a place where they have no NPC to interact with, right? But you should always be looking for an angle to work an NPC into the story. When I was writing, some of my adventures, whenever I'm scripting out or writing an adventure, I am constantly looking for exciting and interesting ways for the players to have someone to interact with. When I was writing Crypt of the Everflame, I decided that there would be a survivor in the dungeon just to give the players someone to interact with, someone to roleplay with, someone who could deliver exposition, who could explain what's going on here, and could also serve as a point of role-playing for the GM. When I was running Knights of Everflame, someone in chat pointed out that Lucky is an evolving NPC. Lucky started out as what I would say was a recurring character. He's part of the cast of people who was with the players at the beginning. Maybe even arguably supporting cast. He evolved even beyond that into villain, kind of becoming the focus of a story. That's almost an entirely other level. For those of you who have been watching Band of Bravos, the newest stream that I've been running on the Paizo Twitch, I have introduced a character that is to be honest, a ghost. He's not even really alive. He's a ghost who's stuck with the PCs now. Good old Grisfell is my way of making sure that in a dungeon filled with undead and things that the players can't really interact with, I put in a character that they can play with, someone they can talk to, someone they can get information from, but they can also, ignore when it is not relevant to the story. And that gets me to the later point of this, that when you're looking for ways to insert NPCs, look beyond humanoids. Look beyond the normal choices for NPCs. Doesn't have to be just dwarves and elves and halflings and gnomes and goblins. Sentient weapons can be NPCs. Friendly ghosts, singing mirrors, monsters, deities, spells that were cast the wrong way. There's lots of things that can create an NPC-like experience in your game. I think intelligent items are a great way to do it. Mysterious familiars are fantastic, especially if you have a witch in the group. Having a familiar that isn't quite what it seems, that seems to know more than it's letting on, is a great NPC. That's a great sidekick character. I think it's important to note that when you're building your NPCs, these need to become the exceptions, not the rule, unless that's the type of story you're telling. So you want to make sure that you populate your world with plenty of kind of ordinary folk. It is their ordinary plainness that allows these others to really pop in the narrative, right? If everybody has a talking familiar that has a quirky personality, well, I mean, I guess you're doing the Golden Compass RPG. But my point is, then they're not really special, per se. But if one person has one, if one person has a sentient item, it's a lot more special than if everyone does. So, I always like to look for interesting ways to include different oddball NPCs for the players to interact with, but I always make sure to mix it up with plain old ordinary townsfolk as well. Once again, it's about creating a fabric, and then the alterations of that are really kind of how the players can see the texture of your campaign. Now, as we kind of get close to what I think is the wrap-up of most of my main points, I want to give a word of caution about NPCs. It's real easy as the GM for your NPCs to steal the spotlight. And as GM, that can be very tempting. It feels like you're the player. You have to avoid doing that. You have to remember the story is about the PCs and their actions. The NPCs are there to serve as an accent, as a flavor. Take my poor ghost Grisfell. He can't help them almost at all. He is almost entirely powerless. The only thing he was able to help them with was a few choice command words that he could utter, but that's about it. He's a ghost. He can't really help. He can hang out and be sarcastic, and that's about it, because he doesn't really have any other powers or abilities. You're not always going to have that. Sometimes you're going to have sidekicks and whatnot who are capable of fighting and defending on their own, and they are going to get moments where the dice say that they do something awesome. That's okay too. But you have to be cognizant of, if they're doing that all the time, then you're probably playing them the wrong way. They probably need to be scaled back, and they definitely shouldn't be more powerful than the PCs, especially when you get to that sidekick style character. Those almost always have to be less powerful than the PCs. And if they are more powerful because the story needs them to be, then they need to be restrained in some way to prevent them from wandering around stealing the spotlight. I do want to put a caveat on that you could, of course, tell a cool story about the players escorting some incredibly powerful champion into a dungeon and they are his sidekicks for the adventure. That might be an interesting flip on the script. I would do that once, and I would make sure it's precisely one session long, and then I would move on to something else. But I think it could be fun. And you know what? That kind of comes back around to the entire point of NPCs. They are a critical tool in the GM's toolkit for the GM to have a lot of fun at the table. Oftentimes the GM's job can be managing rules and statistics and spells and magic items and treasure. But let me tell you, they are critically important for the GM to actually have a voice in the story, a voice in the narrative. And you're just not going to get that any other way. So, when you're building NPCs, there's a lot of things to think about, but it is really important that you keep an eye on how you're going to be able to use them to have a good time. All right, let's sum it up. NPCs in play. First of all, use them as the texture. Create the fabric of your world out of NPCs. Arguably, the entire fabric of your world is the places, the people, and the stories that inhabit it. One of those three are the people and the other characters that you need to interact with. Next up, they are on-demand interaction. That you always have to be ready for improv RPG experiences with the players. You have to be ready to generate and create those at any given moment. But don't let that improv go to waste. Use it to design and flesh out your world. As a matter of fact, that's one of the best ways to design a place. Build the things that you know are critical, and then let play determine all of the other components. Let play dictate the other things that you need. Don't be afraid to evolve your NPCs. Promote them and demote them as needed to make your world make sense. Remember that NPCs are everywhere. Find a way to put them in the dungeon. Find a way to put them in the Vault of the Golems. Find a way to put them in the trackless desert where there are no other characters. Find a way to put an NPC in there. Maybe there's a ghost at an oasis. Maybe there's a wind elemental that guides them on their way and taunts them. Anything to give you a way to interact with the player characters. If they're just talking to themselves, it's going to get stale pretty quick. A talking cactus. Yes, that. Go beyond the basics of humanoid NPCs, right? Monsters make great choices. Sentient artifacts make great choices. Almost anything that can talk and have a personality is an NPC. Remember, avoid the spotlight. Use your NPCs to accent the story, to help guide the story, but remember, the story is about the player characters and their action. And finally, use them to stir up the story and use them to have some fun. So, with that, I think we're done with the formal part of the lecture. Let's open it up for some Q&A here. Let me get a few things up and running here. Where is my chat box? Here it is. I got the tip jar too. All right. So, if those of you in chat have questions, I'll be happy to take those now. While folks are typing them out, I want to remind all of those of you who are watching this on YouTube that this lecture series airs on Twitch, on my Twitch channel, live every Saturday starting at 4 p.m. So, stop on by. We have a good time. And afterwards, we play random video games and get people killed. It's great. Apple knees. The GM should be the number one BSer at the table. Gotcha. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah. P. Fred's asking me about Omelet's axe from Knights of Everflame. Yeah. That's one of those, it evolved from a magic item to an NPC, right? It at first was just this cool weapon, and then it slowly started talking, and then it had motives of its own, right? I think that is a critical skill of GMing is to realize that there are going to be opportunities, and you have to decide which ones are worth turning into an NPC and which ones are just kind of, you let them fall to the wayside. And a lot of times your players are going to be the ones to dictate that to you, right? They are going to be the ones that look at your piece of the story and decide which NPCs are important. They kind of do that for you. That's a good tip, Irish. When the players do kind of decide, right? When they interact with an NPC, they are basically giving you permission as GM to add story to that character, right? To make that character more than it is, because they've picked, right? Alara's asking me, what's the most unexpected development in a basic NPC to something more that you have seen? For those of you who are familiar with Knights of Everflame spoilers, you might want to skip forward 20 seconds. I think, Lucky started out as a throwaway character that I thought was going to die in the second episode, and they let him get away, and because of the timing of the episode, he got away. And then as the season went on, they kept harping about him, and I wrote more into him about season 1, and literally as we were about to start the finale, I was sitting there thinking about what to do with Lucky, because I hadn't figured it out. He was supposed to die. He was supposed to get thrown in prison. I didn't really know what he was, and I had this entire evolving backstory, and I literally decided, in the middle of filming that episode, that he was going to play a part in the finale. I won't tell you what it is, and I won't go beyond that. Those of you who watch the show know where that leads. But I honestly think that he started out as little more than a recurring character and ended up being a critical part of the story by the end of the first season. So, yeah. And ultimately, this comes down to kind of a lot of managing good NPCs comes down to a super critical GMing skill, which is just listening to your players and giving them what they want. It seems obvious, but it's so easy as a GM to let your desire to see the story take control, to see your ego impose itself on the narrative in a way that isn't necessarily healthy for the story. Just listen to your players. They're going to tell you what they want. They're usually not even very subtle about it. They're going to interact with the players that they find interesting, make those characters more important to the story. You could almost start an entire campaign off by creating an interesting town with interesting characters in it. You have literally no stories developed except for something that brings them all together to let them meet all these characters. And let them pick who they find interesting, and then build more stories based off those characters. That is a very interesting way to build a more sandbox-style campaign. Instead of the sandbox being a map filled with unexplored hexes, the sandbox is a town of NPCs. You interact with the ones you want. That's how the story develops. That can be a lot of fun. The best laid plans of mice and jams always go astray. That's very true. Goblin comic relief with hats. That's always a good idea as a GM. Always want to include... comic relief NPCs are really important, actually. I find that players... You can have characters who approach this thing from I am the joke character, I am the comic relief. But not always, right? And you may find a group that doesn't have that character, but having a little comic relief in a story, especially one that's grim and serious, it can add that right kind of flavor. As a GM, I love to tell stories that have lighthearted and grim elements in them. I like the push and pull of emotion there, right? That's a classic storytelling trick, is you never want to repeat the same beat, the same story beat, over and over and over and over and over again. It gets dull. The human mind doesn't like seeing the same narrative beat play out over and over and over again. You like seeing the upside, the downside, things that work well, things that work bad. That's why whenever you watch your action movie, good things happen to the characters, then bad things, then good things, then bad things, because it's that push-pull between upbeats and downbeats that makes a story interesting. If it's all downbeats, it feels depressing. If it's all upbeats, it feels too easy. I think it's a real rookie storytelling move not to understand that push-pull exists. NPCs can help you maintain that narrative because you can't always control whether or not the players are providing upbeats or downbeats. NPCs are a tool by which you can do that. Yeah, I mean, Irish says that you can always outsource and have someone help you with NPCs. That's absolutely true. You totally can. I have done some cooperative GMing. As a matter of fact, as someone who loves to write stories, I like to put them together and bounce the entire story off other people. I like to use other people to workshop it because they will oftentimes ask me questions that the players might anticipate, which helps me develop them further. The same can go with NPCs, right? When you're building NPCs, having a cast of them, but maybe bounce them off somebody else. Bounce them off someone who's not related. Use them to kind of fill out some of the gaps and have them ask some questions. And every once in a while, they'll ask you a question that you're like, oh, I didn't really think about that. That makes that character really not appropriate or really problematic for one way or another. And it's good to have that kind of logic and reality check built into some of these characters to make sure that you're not doing some things that are going to cause you troubles down the road. So does anyone else have any other questions about NPCs and using them at your table? We got a few minutes left here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I particularly want to highlight. I think, having an NPC, I always like to have an anchor NPC in my stories as well. Someone who's everyone is tied to, everyone knows. I think that's a good way for the GM to have some agency in how the story starts and where it's heading. Borrowed characters from other game groups, yeah. A good GM never lets anything go to waste, right? And if you're playing with a new group of people, going back to previous adventures and picking up NPCs and picking up characters that you've liked and enjoyed and already kind of have some of the background for just because you remember the story they were in and just using them as NPCs in your new story, that works great. Yeah, I think the only danger of that is if you're playing with people, the same group over and over and over again. They might start recognizing that you're cribbing from the past. But even then, I oftentimes pick up characters from media. I love the folks at the Glass Cannon podcast, and they do this all the time, and they do it for a very specific reason, and it seems kind of hokey, but they're doing it because it helps them characterize faster, which is whenever a new NPC gets introduced, they'll mention a famous actor or actress, and that's how they talk or that's how they act. And all of a sudden, you automatically know what that character is. They don't have to get to know the character. You automatically kind of fill in the details based on the name that they drop. That's a simple trick to do. It can break verisimilitude, but it's a lot of fun. It's an effective technique. So you can also do that with other shows that you watch, right? I mean, if you're watching other actual plays and you find characters in those interesting, lift them. A good GM is someone who borrows NPCs from every piece of media they can find. I think that's really important. Yeah, exactly, right? This is Alan Rickman, but his name is Fred. Yeah, exactly. When an NPC is really liked by the PCs as an adventure hook, do you ever, and if so, how do you handle putting them in mortal danger or even killing them without it going sideways? That is, to be honest, a big danger, right? The NPCs become such a critical part of the story that you can suddenly get very protective of them. You can want to make sure that they make it through, that they continue being a part of the narrative, to the point where you actually end up kind of breaking the story by not endangering them, by not having it make sense for them to end up in a dangerous situation or in mortal peril. And to be honest, sometimes that's what an NPC's job is there to do, right? I have certainly introduced NPCs to people in recent adventures whose entire job it was to get to know the PCs and then die. Because that's what needed to happen to have the story have some depth to it. I think it's really important because the players the players are the heroes of the story, right? They are the focus of the narrative. But for most narratives to have teeth, for most narratives to have a sense of stake, they have serious stakes. That somebody needs to die, somebody needs to be in mortal danger, and that can't necessarily be the player characters because they're the protagonists. So, they'll be in danger because they're fighting against the forces of evil. But if you want to start things off with some serious notes, somebody's got to die. And nameless, unimportant characters, NPCs make great stakes, yeah. To have some nameless, unimportant character die doesn't have any weight. The player characters are very easily able to dismiss that, right? I started a home campaign a number of years back here in Seattle with some folks, and the initial part of the story was that the players all had to have a meaningful relationship with the town sage. And that could be, he was a mentor to them, he was friendly to them, it could be anything. And everyone was required to have that connection. That way, in the first story arc, when that sage gets kidnapped, it suddenly becomes the main driver for why they all know each other, for why they are all adventuring together, because this character means something to all of them. But to do that, I had to make them care about that character, which means I couldn't have them be kidnapped right away, because I had to set up the NPC as someone important, someone who they cared about, someone who was kind and giving to them. That way, when that character was in danger, that story actually had weight. And that's the trick of any story, is making the players give you a reason to care. That helps you tell the story, that helps the story have drama and weight. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, right, the danger can also then twist and deform your story, right? I think, once again, your job in just GM is half planning and half reacting to PC action or inaction, and making sure your story survives that. That can often be as much, if not more, work than the writing itself. Understanding that the players may kill an NPC that you thought was really important and valuable. Once again, be ready to pick up those pieces and assign it to a different character, or build a new character for whom that makes sense. If you had an NPC who has this vital piece of information that the PCs need to have, but the NPC dies before he can give it, well, maybe that was also in a journal, and now his kid has it, and the kid comes seeking out the PCs because the NPC meant to tell them and just never got the chance. There's always another way to move the story forward. It's a very rare occurrence where I've ever heard a GM tell me a tale that is, yep, this happened and I was stuck and there was literally no way out of it. And I'm like, well, I mean, if that's the case, odds are you put yourself there. But, it doesn't happen too often. I think, generally speaking, there's always a way to move the story forward, to assign those sorts of pieces to a different character and keep things moving. All right, we have time for maybe one last question. If anybody has one last simple question, I'll be happy to answer it, as we are running up to the end of the clock here today. I think this has been a good lecture. I do want to remind folks, these lectures do get loaded up on my YouTube channel every Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So if you missed part of this, if you missed the beginning, if you missed previous streams, you can always catch them on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Jason Bulmahn. Yeah. Poor Bort. I have to admit, I've been very cruel to NPCs over the years. I'm not exactly the nicest person when it comes to NPCs. I love them. I really do. They're good. They're backbones of my story. But in that, they are the disposable part of the tale. I will do whatever it is necessary to them to keep my story moving forward. And I hope you have learned to do the same. So, I think that about wraps up everything I have for you all here today. I want to thank you all for watching. As a reminder, you can find me on various platforms on social media where I talk about gaming, where I talk about my work at Paizo, where I talk about fun nerd stuff that I find. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, Instagram, all / Jason Bulmahn, JASON BULMAHN. Make sure to put that H in the right spot, otherwise you'll never find me. And if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you get a heads up when I post a new video, usually about once a week. So thank you for watching, everybody, and we will see you next time.